Back in the day, pests shaped the way families cared for their gardens. Every row had to be watched closely because losing even a few plants could mean less food on the table. Slugs, caterpillars, and beetles tested the patience of every homesteader. Yet your grandparents found clever ways to fight back. They leaned on what the earth and the home could offer, from flowers that protected crops to scraps that became traps. Here are 25 strange pest remedies that kept 1930s gardens thriving, starting with the most unexpected. Hot pepper spray for chewing insects. Some pests ignored barriers and borders, chewing leaves straight through. For these, your grandparents turned to fire itself, the heat of chili peppers. They blended hot peppers with garlic, soap, and water to make a pungent spray. Applied to leaves, it coated them with a fiery layer insects couldn't stand. Caterpillars, beetles, and leafhoppers recoiled, leaving the plants alone. It wasn't a killer, but a deterrent, making the garden unappetizing to pests. The spray had to be renewed after rain, and gardeners always tested a leaf or two first to be sure the plants could bear it. It worked best when strained through cloth, so nothing clogged the sprayer and it covered the leaves evenly. What began as a kitchen remedy turned into a garden shield, drawn from the same peppers that spiced the table. Yeast traps. Yeast was once a gardener's secret weapon, pressed into service not for baking, but for banishing slugs. Mix 1 cup of flour, 2 cups of water, and 1 sachet of standard yeast. Whisk together, and voila! 1 liquid bread, slug remedy. This mixture, poured into a sunken pot with small notches cut at the rim, became an irresistible lure. After a few days it soured, giving off a tang that slugs simply couldn't resist. Drawn in by the scent, they tumbled down into the trap and drowned, leaving tender seedlings untouched. Old gardeners would check the pots every few mornings, scooping out the catch and refreshing the yeasty brew as needed. This method worked best when refreshed every few nights, while the sour smell was strongest and pot rims were notched, so slugs slipped in with ease. With nothing wasted but the pests themselves, yeast traps earned a place in many gardens as a clever, timeless way to protect greens and cabbages. Copper strips for slug and snail control. Slugs and snails were among the most persistent garden thieves, leaving ragged holes in lettuces and slimy trails across cabbage leaves. Your grandparents discovered that copper could stop them in their tracks. When the damp bodies of these pests touched a strip of copper, it created a tiny electric charge that gave them an unpleasant shock. They turned back instantly, sparing the plants beyond. Strips of copper were nailed around raised beds, wrapped around pots, or even fastened to the base of fruit trees, forming a solid barrier that slugs and snails would not dare to cross. Once installed, it needed almost no attention, quietly protecting vulnerable crops season after season. The strips gave stronger results when fixed in solid rings, leaving no gaps for pests to sneak through. Mole cricket rain gutter traps. Mole crickets gave farmers nightmares. These insects tunneled under the soil, slicing roots and toppling seedlings before they had a chance. Instead of bait, your grandparents reached for scraps. Old rain gutters, cut into short sections, were set upright in the earth. Each became a slick-sided chute, leading straight down to a tin can or glass jar waiting at the bottom. The mole crickets tumbled in and never found their way out. The trap caught more when jars were level with the soil, so the crickets slipped in and couldn't climb back out. No poisons, no fuss, just a trap that used gravity as its ally. Folks often placed them near moist ground or fresh plantings, where the pests like to wander. Checking the jars each morning was part of the routine, emptying out the catch before resetting. Predator silhouettes for birds. Birds could ruin a row of sprouts in an afternoon. Your grandparents knew that scaring them off didn't always require noise or movement. Instead, they made shadows of fear. Shapes of hawks, owls, or even stalking cats were cut from tin or wood, painted black, and lifted on poles above the beds. To a bird's sharp eye, those still figures spelled danger. Some gardeners moved them around every few days, so the trick never grew stale. The shape scared birds longer when shiny bits of tin were added, making them look alive and harder to ignore. The silhouettes loomed over bean rows and berry patches, and flocks steered clear, wary of the watchful shapes. They were simple to craft from scraps and lasted season after season. Sacrificial Nasturtiums. Among the flowers, nasturtiums held a secret role. Bright and cheerful though they looked, they were bait, planted on purpose to take the damage meant for crops. Aphids, flea beetles, and cabbage worms could not resist them. Your grandparents ringed their kale, beans, and broccoli with nasturtiums, watching the pests gather on the decoys instead of spreading through the vegetables. When the plants became crowded with insects, they were pulled up and tossed aside, carrying the trouble away with them. These flowers helped most when planted along fences, keeping insects away from the middle of the garden. It was pest control by diversion, a sacrifice willingly made each year. And while they played guard duty, their blossoms still found a place in the kitchen, tossed into salads with their peppery bite. Garlic and onion border planting. Onions and garlic did more than fill the pantry. In the old gardens, they stood as living guards. Their strong scents confused pests, masking the tender smell of lettuces, carrots, and cabbages. Carrot flies, aphids, and root maggots hesitated at the border, unable to sniff out their targets. The sulfur in the bulbs added another layer of defense, seeping into the soil as a quiet repellent. Borders worked better when the plants were left to flower, since even the blooms added to the strong smell. So, gardeners lined their plots with onions, or tucked garlic cloves between rows of beans and tomatoes. Every inch of space did double duty, food above ground and protection all around. The tall stalks made a green fence, neat and purposeful, and year after year they reduced the pest burden without effort. Beer traps for slugs. Few pests frustrated gardeners more than slugs, their silver trails marking ruined leaves and hollowed stems. Your grandparents lured them to their downfall with beer. Shallow jars or dishes were buried so the rims sat level with the soil, then filled with the cheapest brew at hand. Drawn by the yeasty smell, slugs slid in and drowned overnight. The traps were placed in shady corners and damp spots where the pests loved to hide. The jars trapped the most when shaded with a board that kept the drink strong yet still drew slugs in overnight. Every few days the stale beer was emptied and replaced, keeping the lure fresh. It was a thrifty solution, often using leftovers from the kitchen or neighbors' bottles. In the morning, crops stood untouched, spared by the sacrifice of a drink. Ducks as natural pest patrol. When slugs and beetles marched into the rows, your grandparents sometimes brought in ducks. Indian runner breeds were prized, their upright gait and endless appetite making them perfect patrolmen. Turned loose in the garden, they poked among the leaves, snapping up caterpillars, weed seedlings, and even fat slugs that no hand dared touch. With a little fencing or guidance, they left the vegetables alone and went straight for the pests. During planting seasons, they were kept to the edges, but between harvests, they roamed free, cleaning the ground for next year's crop. Their work never cost a penny, only a watchful eye to keep them from trampling the tenderest shoots. Beyond pest duty, they left eggs in their wake, adding breakfast to their service. Nesting boxes for beneficial birds and bats. Not all visitors were unwelcome. Swallows, wrens, bluebirds, and bats earned their keep with steady appetites. They devoured mosquitoes, moths, beetles, and caterpillars before the pests could strip the crops. Your grandparents made homes for them, small wooden boxes nailed to fence posts, tree trunks, or shed walls. Each box offered shelter, and in return, the creatures stayed close, circling over fields and flitting between rows. The boxes lasted longer when set out of the wind, keeping them dry so creatures returned each year. Families carved the boxes from scrapboards, painted them with leftover tar or oil, and watched year after year as new tenants returned. The garden buzzed with wings, and fewer hands were needed to spray or squash. Wine bottle whistles for moles and voles. Tunnels beneath the soil spelled ruin, roots chewed and beds collapsing without warning. To fend off moles and voles, your grandparents pressed empty glass bottles into the ground, necks poking just above the surface. When the wind blew, the air sang a hollow whistle down the bottle. To human ears, it was faint, almost a sigh. But underground, the vibration hummed through the soil, unsettling the creatures. The steady noise made the burrows feel unsafe, and soon the pests drifted elsewhere. The bottles worked best when several were spread around, making the ground hum everywhere and driving pests off. It was a trick that cost nothing but the bottles left over from the kitchen or cellar. Sticky grease bands for crawling pests. Fruit trees in the orchards faced steady assault from ants, caterpillars, and climbing beetles. To stop the march, your grandparents wrapped trunks with bands of cloth or paper, then coated them in sticky grease or heavy petroleum jelly. The insects crawled up, hit the band, and stuck fast. No ladders, no reaching the leaves or fruit above. The bands held up better when tied over paper, so they could be replaced easily without hurting the bark. Every few weeks, the bands were refreshed, keeping the barrier strong through the season. Children sometimes joined in, smearing the bands with fresh grease, turning chores into play. The trees bore their fruit untouched, guarded not by sprays, but by a sticky line drawn by hand. Buried potato trap for wireworms. Wireworms were sneaky pests, chewing through roots and tubers before anyone saw the damage. Your grandparents used one of the simplest tricks to catch them, a raw potato. They sliced it in half and buried it a few inches deep. The potato acted like a beacon, luring wireworms to burrow inside for a feast. After a few days, the trap was dug up, and the riddled potato, along with its wriggling culprits, was tossed out of the garden. This baiting could be repeated week after week until the numbers dropped. It was a quiet method that showed exactly where infestations lurked, helping gardeners avoid planting in trouble spots. The potato trick was easier when the spots were marked, so gardeners knew where to dig them up. It cost nothing but a potato or two, yet it spared many harvests from ruin. Tansy plantings as natural repellent. Tansy wasn't grown for beauty alone. Its sharp, camphor-like scent had a reputation for turning pests away. Your grandparents tucked tansy along the edges of vegetable plots, letting its feathery leaves and yellow blooms form a living wall of defense. Beetles, moths, ants, and even flies thought twice before crossing the boundary. Some families dried the leaves and kept them indoors to ward off pantry pests like weevils, proof that tansy worked both in the garden and the home. It was strong and sometimes invasive, so it needed a firm hand, but when managed carefully, it protected more vulnerable crops like cucumbers, cabbage, and squash. Tansy stayed strong when split every few years, keeping the plants healthy and the smell sharp. No sprays or powders were needed, just a sturdy herb that stood its ground year after year. Dill to attract beneficial insects. Not every insect spelled trouble. Some were allies, feeding on the very pests that ruined crops. Your grandparents planted dill to bring those helpers closer. Its fine leaves and umbrella-shaped flowers were irresistible to lacewings, ladybugs, and tiny parasitic wasps. These guests feasted on aphids, caterpillars, and other soft-bodied invaders, turning the tide of battle in favor of the garden. Dill fit easily along the borders of tomato and pepper rows, adding both flavor for the kitchen and defense for the plants. Dill helped more when sown in stages, giving fresh flowers all summer for good insects to feed on. Every flower became a miniature battlefield where the good bugs outnumbered the bad. Stem wrapping for squash vine borers. Squash vine borers were dreaded foes, hollowing out stems until a healthy plant collapsed overnight. Your grandparents fought them with a barrier made by hand. They wrapped the lower stems in strips of cloth, foil, or even old stockings, creating a sleeve that blocked the moths from laying their eggs at the base. The wrapping held better when tied just above the first leaf, where pests often tried to get in. Around the soil, they sometimes dusted with wood ash for extra protection. The method cost nothing more than scraps and a few minutes of work, but it saved entire crops of zucchini and pumpkins. Checking and rewrapping became part of the summer routine, as vital as watering or weeding. It was a small defense against a pest that could destroy a season's effort in days. Handpicking Colorado potato beetles. Colorado potato beetles could strip a potato patch bare in days, leaving nothing but stems behind. Your grandparents tackled them the simplest way possible, by hand. Early in the morning, when the beetles moved slowly, they walked the rows with a jar of soapy water in hand. The beetles were easier to spot when rows were mulched lightly, standing out against the pale ground. Each beetle plucked from a leaf was dropped into the jar, never to return. They crushed the clusters of yellow eggs hidden under the leaves, stopping the next wave before it began. Children often joined in, turning it into a game of who could collect the most. It may have looked tedious, but in small gardens it worked better than any spray. With sharp eyes and steady hands, they kept the damage in check and saved the harvest. Homemade soapy water for aphids. Aphids clung to tender shoots and the undersides of leaves, draining sap until plants weakened. Your grandparents fought them with soap. A few drops of mild soap mixed into water made a spray that stripped the protective coating from the soft-bodied insects. Spritzed directly onto clusters, it killed them quickly without harming the plants. Spraying was done in the cool hours of morning or evening when the sun wouldn't scorch the wet leaves. It was an easy solution, mixed right in the kitchen and safe for ladybugs and bees. Soapy sprays held longest when mixed with a little oil so they clung to the leaves. The bottle could be refilled as often as needed, keeping pressure down through the growing season. Roses, peas, and lettuces all stood taller for it. Marigolds for pest confusion and nematodes. Marigolds did more than brighten borders with gold and orange. Their roots released compounds that repelled nematodes, those tiny worms that gnawed underground. Above ground, their pungent scent confused flying pests like whiteflies and aphids, steering them away from the vegetables nearby. Marigolds gave protection when planted thick and kept blooming through deadheading, since their scent confused pests. Your grandparents planted them thickly along rows of beans, tomatoes, and peppers, creating both beauty and defense. Even when plucked for bouquets, their neighbors in the soil stayed protected. The flowers earned their place year after year as companions that guarded, as well as they bloomed. Scented soap to repel deer. Deer looked gentle, but they could undo a garden in a single night, trampling rows and stripping tender shoots bare. Your grandparents hung scented soap as their defense. These kept deer away when hung in mesh bags along fences where they spread their smell. The strong fragrance unsettled the deer's sensitive noses, making the space feel unfamiliar and unsafe. Laundry soaps and herbal bars were often used for extra punch. A single bar could last weeks, swaying in the breeze while guarding the crops. It was low-cost, simple, and effective, especially for those who couldn't afford fences or elaborate barriers. Diatomaceous earth sprinkling at plant bases. Tiny as they were, insects like beetles and maggots caused outsized destruction when they found tender stems or roots. Your grandparents turned to diatomaceous earth, a fine powder made from crushed fossil shells. Sprinkled lightly at the base of plants, it cut into the bodies of crawling pests, drying them out before they could climb higher. The powder wasn't a poison, and it left crops safe to eat, but it kept ants, earwigs, and larvae at bay. Care had to be taken on windy days so the dust didn't drift, yet when applied after a rain, it worked like a charm. This powder guarded plants best when spread after the morning dew and renewed after rain, so crawling pests never found safe passage. It was a quiet, natural barrier, invisible from a distance, but merciless to intruders. Wood ash around, squash plants as repellent. Squash plants were hardy but vulnerable, their stems and leaves inviting to borers, beetles, and grubs. Your grandparents dusted their bases with wood ash, saved from winter fires and hearth cleanings. The pale powder clung to stems and soil, drying and irritating pests before they could take hold. The scent and texture together made an unwelcoming ring, like a natural shield drawn at the plant's feet. Sometimes it was mixed with sand or even a bit of lime for added strength, but even alone, the ash gave enough protection to save a crop. Ash rings proved most useful when mixed with sand and reapplied after showers, since that dried pests while adding strength to the squash vines. As the season wore on, the ash also worked its way into the earth, lending potassium that strengthened the vines. Crushed eggshells mixed into soil barriers. Even kitchen scraps found use in the garden, and eggshells were never wasted. Your grandparents crushed them fine, scattering the sharp pieces around tender seedlings. The jagged edges formed a rough, dry border that soft-bodied pests like slugs and cutworms refused to cross. Unlike store-bought powders, the shells added minerals to the soil as they broke down, enriching it while defending it. When shells were crushed with sand, gritty rings stopped the slugs while the soil gained its minerals. Sprinkled in rings or mixed with ashes and sand, they created a barrier that worked all season long with only occasional renewal. Hand-picking and crushing pest eggs. Long before sprays promised instant control, pest battles were often won leaf by leaf. Your grandparents searched the undersides of leaves for clusters of insect eggs, especially the bright yellow beads of potato beetles or the pale ovals of moths. With a pinch of their fingers, they ended an invasion before it began. Egg clusters were stopped when leaves were checked in the morning light. Children were often brought along, taught to spot the tiny specks while they combed the rows. Jars of soapy water caught the hatched insects, but the real victory came from breaking the cycle at its source. It was steady, deliberate work, the kind of task best done early in the morning when the dew still clung. The habit spared whole patches from destruction without costing a penny. Boiling water for ant nests. Long before store shelves carried ant powders and sprays, your grandparents turned to the kettle. When ants built their hills between paving stones, under fruit trees, or at the edge of a flower bed, a pot of boiling water was the answer. The steaming pour collapsed tunnels and scalded the colony right where it lived. It wasn't fancy and it wasn't gentle, but it spared the garden from invasion without a drop of poison. It was most effective right after rain when the soil was soft and the boiling water sank deeper into the nest. People repeated the treatment a few days in a row if the ants rebuilt, and soon the nests were gone. The trick worked best in tight places where baits couldn't reach, like the cracks of a stone path. It was quick, decisive, and cost nothing but the effort of heating water. Which of these methods would you rely on for your garden? Let us know in the comments below. If you learned something new today, make sure to subscribe to the channel. See you in the next video.